June 6, 1944. After many months of preparation, the Allies finally make up their minds and carry out the opening of a second front in France. Although the original plan was to reach Paris in a few days, and Berlin before the year was out, the Allies ended up getting stuck in Normandy for more than 2 months. Next in this program, we are going to look at the top 5 mistakes the Allies made during the Battle of Normandy, which led to them not being able to meet the goals they had set for themselves. Once this introduction is done, let's start with the first point. This refers to the bad assessment made by the Allies of the German troops they were going to face. In any case, we have to make a differentiation. On the one hand, there were the high-ranking officers like Eisenhower, who were aware of how difficult the situation was, and on the other, the soldiers, whom they tried to motivate as much as possible. The idea that was transmitted to the Allied soldiers is that the German troops they would face were of poor quality, since the German army was already practically defeated. To this, we have to add that many expected the Air Force and Navy to do all the work, so they would just have to finish clearing the way. For example, when they found out that they had to fight against the 12th Panzer Division of the Waffen-SS, the Allied soldiers made a joke about it. This one said, "Instead of shooting them with bullets, we're going to give those kids bottles." As we all know, they soon changed their attitude against these teenagers when they saw their ferocity in combat. After being trapped in the Normandy region, and with the inability of the offensives they launched to break through the German defenses to succeed, many soldiers became discouraged, and morale dropped considerably. Furthermore, we must add that the number of casualties in each of these failed offensives was very high. Finally, and after many combats, the Allied soldiers were hardening, and morale increased again in the face of an increasingly diminished enemy. However, as it may seem, the British would again make the mistake of underestimating the Germans when they launched Operation Market Garden. In short, we have to indicate that you can never consider an enemy defeated, because if you do, you will suffer serious consequences. The second point on our list is the Allied inability to seize a suitable port in order to have a good rate of supply. After the failed breakout of the German positions during the first weeks of the operation, in which the Allies intended to conquer all of France, the Battle of Normandy became a war of attrition, in which the side with the most resources would end up winning. As is evident, the Allies needed, on the one hand, to cut off all German supply lines, for which they used their aviation and different sabotage operations on the German railway lines, and on the other hand, to unload enormous quantities of material in French soil. One of the main objectives was to take the port of Cherbourg, from which it was intended to ensure a good point for unloading supplies. Although they were able to take the city by the end of June, the destruction that the Germans made in the port was so great that it was not possible to leave the port operational until mid-August. At that time, the Allies already had other ports under their control and Cherbourg was practically not necessary. In any case, the main option that the Allies had designed was a series of artificial floating concrete ports that they established on the landing beaches. It was for them that all the material that made it possible for the fighting to continue was downloaded. The negative point was that they did not offer the same guarantees as those of a fixed port, such as Cherbourg or Le Havre. The consequences of this manifested themselves when on June 19, 2 weeks after the start of operations, a major storm broke out in the English Channel. This storm, which lasted about 4 days, caused considerable damage to these buildings, and was about to have made the entire operation fail if the damage had been greater. Finally, an attempt was also made to build an underwater pipeline, which would carry fuel from England to Normandy, called Operation Pluto. Although this pipeline could finally be built, it had many problems and delays, and by the time it wanted to be operational, the Allies were already quite far from the beaches of Normandy. The third point that we have compiled for the program are the numerous mistakes that the Allied aviation made in Normandy when it came to bombing the German positions. To give us an idea of the devastation that these bombings caused, we have to point out that the Allied bombing during Operation Goodwood alone, which was aimed at opening a breach in the German defensive lines southeast of Seine, the Allies used 2,400 bombers. The bombs dropped by these planes had a destructive power similar to an 8-kiloton atomic bomb, which would be half the power of the bomb that fell on Hiroshima. This type of action was repeated over and over again and preceded each Allied offensive. Another noteworthy fact is that due to these bombings that the Allies did on French soil, more French civilians died as collateral damage than Englishmen died during the bombings that the Germans did on Great Britain. The worst thing for the Allies was that it was not easy to control such firepower, and in almost all these operations they ended up dropping bombs on their own positions, and many Allied soldiers were also killed by their own bombs. Finally, and despite so much destructive power, the Allied offensives got stuck again and again without breaking the German lines, which made the Allied leaders desperate and generated great discomfort. The fourth error that we are going to analyze is the lack of experience and decision that the Allies had to adequately exploit the successes they had on the battlefield. While their offensives were heavily manned and armored, they lacked the right momentum, and once they advanced a few miles, they tended to stall. This was something the Germans had mastered to perfection during the early years of the war. Generals like Rommel or Guderian had been masters when it came to breaking enemy lines and carrying out rapid advances that completely disrupted the enemy rearguard. However, the Allied offensives were very timid and never advanced with sufficient determination and speed. They were very concerned about their flanks, and would stop at any German resistance however weak. This way of acting so slow, towards that the Germans had enough time to send reinforcements to the rupture zone, and thus it was achieved by finishing stopping the Allied offensives. One of the reasons why Patton stood out so much is because he precisely had this impetus and way of proceeding. The fifth point refers to the poor coordination between the Allies and their different military bodies. Again, and with the intention of better understanding, we will make a comparison with the German army. As we know, one of the greatest achievements of the German army was that all its elements had a great coordination with each other. Communication between the ground troops, whether they were soldiers on foot, in tanks, or artillery, as well as with the air force, was total. This allowed them to obtain many victories in numerical inferiority, because the sum of all these elements made them easily overcome their enemies. That all their combat forces were connected and coordinated was something that the Allies tried, but they did not get until the final phase of the Normandy campaign. This made them once again not act with the necessary speed, and added to the division between the different Allied commands, it came to hinder their advance many times. And what do you think? Do you consider that they made another much more serious mistake that we have not included in this list? How do you think they could have broken the siege during the first weeks of the landing? I leave you in the description another program that we made about it, analyzing in this case the main mistake that the Germans made. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.